How do you determine whether you're better off buying or renting a home? Is there one rule of thumb that can make the buying versus renting decision a little easier? And how can you get cash for an old smartphone you no longer need? We'll answer these questions and more on this, the 59th episode of the DoughRoller Podcast.
Welcome to the DoughRoller Podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Hey, everybody, it's Rob Berger. Thank you for tuning in to the 59th episode of the DoughRoller Podcast. The main topic of today, buying versus renting, actually comes from a listener who emailed me a question, which I'll read you in just a little bit. Before we get to that, though, a couple of quick things. First of all, in the weekly newsletter that goes out every Saturday, and if you haven't subscribed, you can do that at DoughRoller.net/newsletter. Real simple, just your name and email address. I send out a newsletter once a week. It's the only way I use your email. I don't do anything else with your email address. I don't flood your inbox with emails. One a week. But in the last email newsletter that went out, I offered to host a free webinar for those interested in learning a little bit about blogging and how you can make money online. And as I was preparing that newsletter, I thought, well, that's fine. And what prompted that was I get a lot of email from folks asking me about that. And so that's what prompted that thought and that offer. And then I thought, well, I shouldn't leave out the folks who maybe are not interested in blogging, but are interested in personal finance and investing, since that is what this show is all about. So in the newsletter, I also said, hey, and I'll also do a webinar on personal finance and investing. Basically, the idea for both of these was you throw at me whatever questions you've got, and I'll do my best to answer them on a live webinar. And I said, in the email, look, if I can get 5 people that are interested in either of these, I'll be happy to do it. And if only a couple people end up showing up, fine with me. Well, boy, the response was just overwhelming. Literally, my inbox was flooded. I spent a couple of hours earlier this week just responding to the folks who said, yep, I'll be there. Tell me when. So if you don't get the newsletter and you're interested in that, please subscribe to it. I'm now trying to figure out how in the world to set up a webinar, but that's my problem. I'll figure it out. And then I'm going to have some more information in upcoming newsletters about the schedule for those. Again, I'm going to do them both. You're welcome to join both of them, one of them, whatever. But you won't know about it if you don't subscribe to the newsletter. So again, that's DoughRoller.net/newsletter. So with that, let's get right to the money tool of the day, and it's Gazelle.com, Gazelle.com. Gazelle.com is a place where you can sell old gadgets that you don't need, don't want, including things like an iPhone. And this has been of interest to me because, as I've mentioned in previous shows, I'm in the process of getting rid of my iPhone and expensive 2-year cell phone contract and heading over to Republic Wireless. And I know I'm a Mac addict. I know I'm sitting here looking at my giant iMac as I record this podcast, and it'll be heartbreaking. But there's one thing I like a little bit better than an iPhone tied to a 2-year contract, and that is money in the bank. And so that's right. I'm moving away from the iPhone, going to a Moto X with Republic Wireless. And saving a ton of money. So the question is, well, how can I get some dough for my iPhone? Gazelle is one option. It's not the only one, but it's one option where you can go in and very quickly they'll tell you what your phone is worth, what they'll pay for it. You answer a few questions: the condition of the phone, what carrier it's with, is there any damage? Has it had any water damage, and that sort of thing. In my case, they offered me $230 in cash for an iPhone 5. And so there are other options. Best Buy buys phones back. You can sell your phones back to your wireless carrier, in my case, Verizon Wireless, or even Apple, although what I found with those options is you don't get cash, you get gift cards. So, if you're going to use it, if you need to buy something through your carrier, wireless carrier, or perhaps Apple, that might be a good option. You'll get more for it in the form of a gift card. Of course, the other thing you could do is you could get, actually, it's funny, this just occurred to me as I'm recording this podcast. I could get the gift card and then sell the gift card. There are sites where you can sell the gift card, so I suppose that's an option, although it'll involve a little more work. But in any event, the money tool of the day, Gazelle.com, where you can sell old gadgets, including iPhones and iPods and tablets. So if you've got some old gadgets you want to convert to cash, you might at least give them a try, see what they will pay for your old gadgets. Okay, now on to the main topic of the day, buying versus renting. And this comes from a listener named Joe. Here's what Joe had to say. Could you do an article on renting versus buying? Or if it's been done, could you point me in the right direction? Well, I haven't really done an extensive article or podcast on renting versus buying. And so Joe's question is timely. And I know it's a question that a lot of people struggle with. If it's a question you're not currently facing, you probably know someone who is, and perhaps you can point them in the direction of this podcast. What I want to do today to help you, to really empower you to make this decision. You hopefully you know me well enough by now. I'm not going to tell you that buying is always right or that renting is always right. That's just plain silly. But instead, what I'm going to try to do is empower you to make the best decision for you and your family. And I'm going to do that in a couple of ways. The first thing is I'm just going to kind of map out a framework, a way to think about this question. That's the first thing. And as part of that, I'm going to point you in the direction of a wildly complicated spreadsheet for those that love spreadsheets. If you want to, really crunch the numbers. For the rest of us who maybe, don't want to open up a spreadsheet and crunch the numbers, I'm then going to talk about sort of 4 general rules that will point you in one direction or another. Will point you either towards renting or towards buying. Then we're going to talk about the rule of 15, which is a simple rule that can help you quickly assess whether buying or renting is best in where you live, in your neighborhood, in your city. And then I'm going to wrap up with 2 online tools that can help you further analyze this question. So we got a lot to cover. Let me get right to it. So the framework, and I guess before I get to the framework, let me just say one other thing. Today the focus of the show is sort of the numbers, the numbers, the economics behind whether you should buy or rent. There are, I think, other factors that go into this question. I mean, for example, for us, we wanted a place to call our own. That was important to us. We like owning. That's not something I can necessarily put a number to, but it's an important consideration for us. It may or may not be an important consideration for you. The flip side, some folks just don't want the headache of owning. It's not even so much a question of the money, but when something breaks, they'd prefer to call the landlord to deal with it, and they just don't want the headache. And so, these are important considerations. They're just not the focus of the show today. We're going to try to focus more on the numbers and the economics behind it. So let's first sort of think about and talk about a framework for analyzing this. At one level, it's really kind of simple. It's no different than analyzing any other choice option that we may have in the world of personal finance. On the one hand, you want to figure out, okay, for this choice, whether buying or renting, what am I going to pay out of my pocket? And at the end of some period of time, what am I going to have to show for it? And just comparing them, right? Simple, but in this case, not so easy. Why is that? Well, on the rent side, it is fairly easy, right? You can simply figure out what your rent is. That should be fairly easy to do. You could make it a little more complicated by saying, well, rent will probably go up over time, so we can assume that it will go up by some amount, say 2 or 3% a year, or whatever other assumption you want to make, and that's what you pay. And you could evaluate that over some period of time, a year, 5 years, 10 years. That's fairly easy, of course, because at the end of that period, you don't obviously own the home or the apartment. You've simply rented it, and so you've lived in the home for that number of years. But after that, you don't own anything. There's nothing else really to compare it to. You simply are evaluating the amount of rent that you're paying. Now that's the easy part of this equation. Where it gets more difficult is on the buying side. Now, why is that? Well, Buying, let's think about it. I mean, buying a home for most of us is probably the most sophisticated transaction we'll ever enter into. For starters, for most of us, there's financing involved. I suppose some will pay cash for a home. Most do not. So there's the question of financing and a down payment and interest payments that you'll make for that financing, closing costs. How do you factor all of that into this equation? Then there's the taxes, right? There are tax benefits to owning a home. There are also some tax, I guess, disadvantages to owning a home, right? So the benefits can be that mortgage interest is deductible, assuming you itemize your deductions. The real estate tax that you pay is deductible. That's good. Of course, the very fact that you have to pay property taxes, that would be a disadvantage to owning. And then there's the tax advantage when it comes time to sell, right? Because you can exclude a certain amount of the capital gains on the sale of a home from taxes. Actually, that's probably the most significant tax advantage to owning a home, but that does complicate the analysis some. What else complicates it? Well, home valuations. Over the long term, home prices, home values generally go up, but as we know from the not too distant past, sometimes they go down. And of course, depending on where you live, home valuations may fluctuate significantly. And so there's the question of, well, what should I assume in terms of a price appreciation or depreciation for the home over a period of time? So that's something that needs to be factored in. And then, of course, there are the costs to maintain the home. We can make estimates of what that will be. Sometimes those estimates will prove to be accurate, and I can tell you as a homeowner, sometimes you get surprised, like we did this past winter when our furnace went out. Big surprise, a big cost. Now we've got a problem with our roof, by the way, so that's going to be another $1,300 to fix our roof. So, there are the maintenance costs, and, you may have homeowners association fees and so forth. So while the framework, conceptually, it's not difficult, you evaluate what you pay and what you receive and compare the two. There are a lot of variables that go into this. So my approach is not to really dive deep into the numbers here. I think there are easier ways to evaluate what is best between renting versus buying, and that's what we're going to turn to. But before I do, I know there are some of you out there that are saying, Rob, I'm just dying to look at a immensely complicated spreadsheet to crunch the numbers. So what I'm going to do in the show notes, and you'll find those at DoughRoller.net/podcast59, that's podcast 59, I am going to include a link to a spreadsheet that was actually put together by the Khan Academy, if you're familiar with that website, a fantastic website that covers just an immense amount of educational material. There's actually a series there on renting versus buying, and they've put together, a pretty complicated spreadsheet. And you can put in there the purchase price and the down payment and the interest, and you can assume certain appreciation of the home. You can put in there your marginal income tax rate, inflation, all kinds of numbers, and it will crunch the numbers for you. So I will put a link to that spreadsheet in the show notes. If you really want to dive into the numbers, check it out. Again, you'll find the show notes at DoughRoller.net/podcast59. Okay, let's move on. So that's the framework. So what are the sort of four general rules that I think can help you assess whether renting versus buying is for you? Well, the first is, how long are you going to stay in the home? This is a really important consideration. By and large, the longer you're going to be in the home, the more it favors buying versus renting. Now, there's no sort of set in stone rule here that if you're in the home 4.5 years, you should buy versus rent. It's not that easy. I think as a general rule, you want to be in the home 5 years or more, or plan to be in a home 5 years or more before you buy. Now, again, that doesn't mean that if you plan to be there less, that buying is absolutely out of the question, or that if you're going to be there longer, renting is out of the question. But I think generally, as a general rule, you want to plan to be in a home 5 years or more before seriously considering buying. That's sort of my approach. part of the reason for that is the cost of selling a home. When you sell a home, you generally pay 6% in realtor fees. You can try to sell it on your own, and some have had success with that, but you generally pay 6% in realtor fees. You pay a number of county taxes, transfer taxes, and other fees. And then you oftentimes will, as part of the deal, agree to pay some of the buyer's closing costs. So I can tell you in my real estate investments in the single-family homes that I own in Ohio, my business partner, who's my best friend from high school, he and I generally assume an 8 to 10% cost of a traditional sale through a realtor. We don't sell our homes through a traditional process if we can. We'd prefer to sell direct to a tenant to avoid those costs. But if we're going to go the traditional route, and most homeowners do, I think you're probably assuming about 8% just to sell the home, and that can eat away significantly at any price appreciation. So for that reason alone, I think a minimum of 5 years as a general rule is what I use. And again, the longer you're going to be in the home, the more it favors buying. So that's the first general rule. The second one is interest rates. This shouldn't come as any surprise. Most of us don't pay cash for a home, and so the lower the interest rates, the more it favors buying. Now, this gets a little more involved because as interest rates go up, oftentimes the home prices can stagnate. So you might get a sort of an offsetting sort of benefit, if you will, when interest rates go up, where it might sort of hold prices down some, maybe, but not always. But again, as a general rule, lower interest rates favor buying. Now, as you probably know, we have seen historically low interest rates for a number of years now. I think the mortgage rates today are not at their lowest that we've seen, but they are still extremely low. And I actually have a widget on DoughRoller.net that tracks current mortgage rates, and I'm actually just going to pull it up real quick here to see what they are as I'm recording this podcast. You can find this if you go to DoughRoller.net/mortgage-rates. But for a 30-year fixed, they look to be in about the 4 to 5% range. Again, your credit score is a big factor in determining what your interest rates will actually be. But that is the second of 4 general rules. The lower the interest rate, the more it favors buying. The third general rule, and this is something that I think is so important, and that is this. We tend to be our own worst enemies. It's true in investing, where we constantly are buying and selling, and selling when the market it goes down out of fear, and then buying when it's too high because out of greed. We do the same thing with I think rent versus buy decisions, and here's what I mean. If you decide to rent because you think it's better financially, that's fine. And maybe your rent is lower than what a mortgage payment would be. Here's the question, though. What are you doing with the difference? Are you saving it? Are you investing it? If you are, that's terrific. If you're not, then that makes buying actually potentially a better option, because with buying, you are sort of forced into automatic savings, where each month you're making your mortgage payment, and while most of that, particularly at the beginning of a mortgage, is going to interest, a big chunk of it is going to pay down the balance of the loan, which increases your net worth every single month. Now, again, if you're good at saving and investing, you may not need that automatic savings. But study after study shows that homeowners' net worths are higher than those that don't own homes, and I think we could reasonably debate why that is. I don't think there's actually a simple explanation, but I do think this sort of automatic savings feature of home ownership is part of the reason why. Now, we can still be our own worst enemy even when we buy a home. How? By treating our home like an ATM machine. Getting that home equity line of credit to increase our lifestyle, by constantly refinancing a mortgage, stretching it back out over 30 years, perhaps doing a cash-out refi so that we can pay credit card debt, which in and of itself may not be a bad decision so long as you don't go back into more credit card debt. So there's no single answer here. but it's something to consider when you make this decision, buying versus renting. If you're going to rent, what are you going to do with the money you may be saving on a month-to-month basis? If you're going to buy, are you going to be careful not to suck the equity out of your home 5, 10, 15 years later for things, to buy things that you shouldn't, or to support a lifestyle you shouldn't be trying to live? So that's the third, I don't know if I call it a general rule, but certainly an important consideration. Okay, the fourth general rule is this, and it's the comparison of the purchase price of a home versus rent for a comparable home. As the disparity between the purchase price and rent increases, that is to say, as rents are relatively low compared to higher purchase prices, it favors renting. Now, that brings me to sort of the third overall point today, and that is the rule of 15. Because you may be asking, okay, Rob, I get that purchase price versus rent, but how do we actually work that out? And that is the rule of 15, and this is a great rule of thumb. And here's how it works. If you can buy a home for less than 15 times your annual rent for a comparable home, it's typically a good deal to buy. So let's think about that. If you had a $150,000 home, you would compare that to rent. If the rent were, say, $15,000 a year, then you'd be right on sort of the borderline. That's exactly 15 times. So you'd be right on the borderline between buying and renting. As rents go up for that $150,000 home, it would support buying. As rents come down, it would support renting. And now, again, this is just a general rule of thumb. It doesn't mean that in your situation, if you do this analysis and the price to rent ratio is, say, 18, that you should not buy. For that matter, it doesn't mean that just because it's 12, you should buy. But I do think it's a good rule of thumb as a starting point for evaluating what's best buying versus renting. Again, it's this. If you can buy a home for less than 15 times your annual rent, it's generally a good deal. Now, if in your area, just because of home prices and the rental market, your price to rent ratio is much higher than that, what that means is if you're going to buy, you're probably going to have to stay in the home longer for buying to be a better deal than renting. Doesn't mean you shouldn't buy, but it just really the key here is it'll help you assess the relative values of buying versus renting so that you go into the transaction with your eyes wide open. So again, I think it's a starting point. I don't think it's the end of the analysis, but I think it's a helpful rule of thumb, the rule of 15, and it's a way to compare the price of a home, the purchase price, versus the annual rent of a comparable home, price to rent ratio. Now, what I've found is that in sort of the high-flying, expensive areas of the country, the price-to-rent ratio is usually higher than 15. You know, you go to very expensive areas of California or the East Coast. You know, you might have to pay $750,000 for a home, but you could rent it for $2,500. Well, that's a price-to-rent ratio of, I think it's around 25, if I've got my math right. That's very common in those expensive areas. Compare that to Ohio, where I'm from, and the price to rent ratios there, I'm seeing them at like 11 and 12 and 13, so you'd be much better off buying. So again, that's going to come down to where you live. So that's the price to rent ratio. Okay, the final thing I want to look at are two tools that can help you with all of this. And the first one actually is kind of uses the rule of 15 that we were talking about. It's a tool that's on Trulia, which is a website, a real estate website, Trulia. And the URL for this tool is rather long, so I'm not even going to bother to read it to you, but it will be in the show notes. And what this is, it's a very colorful map of the United States, and you can very easily pick a couple of different options. You can estimate how long you'll be in the home, 3, 5, or 7 years. There's an option for what your mortgage rate will be, 3.5%, 4.8%, or 6%. And they're using sort of current market rates. Obviously, the difference is going to depend in part on your credit score and your down payment. And then you can also have a selection as to whether you itemize your tax deductions or not. And if you do, what your income tax bracket is, and they give you a couple of options. And once you select those, there are various dots on this map that will change color, and it will show you whether you're better off renting or if it's cheaper to buy. Again, I wouldn't make my decision based on this map, but I think it's a pretty neat tool and one that might help you at least get you started in thinking about this question. And the thing I like about it, among other things, is you can change some of the assumptions. Again, you can say, well, if I live for 7 years in the home, this is what it looks like. But if I only live in the home 3 years, well, according to this tool, it's not such a great deal. Maybe I should be renting instead. So that's the first tool. Again, it's on Trulia. It's what they call it is the rent versus buy, which is cheaper for you. Again, I'll leave a link in the show notes to that. The second tool that I think you'll find useful is a rent versus buy calculator. It's actually on the New York Times website. And again, it has a very long URL, so I apologize. I'll just, rather than trying to read it to you, I'll leave a link in the show notes. I really like this calculator. It's very detailed. You'll put in what the monthly rent for a home is, what the home price is, your down payment, your interest rate on a mortgage, your annual property tax percentage. And what it calculates is basically how long it will take you to make buying better than renting. How long would you have to live in the home for buying to be a better option than renting? And in addition to a very easy to understand graph that it presents a bunch of data about the yearly costs of buying a home versus renting. It's a really great tool. And one thing that I like about it is it's very easy to change the assumptions, change the home price, change the monthly rent, and it will recalculate the values. One of the things I did was put in our home and my guess as to what its value is, and my guess as to what the monthly rent would be if we were to rent a home like this. And when I first put it in, it said we'd be better off, buying would be better than renting after 12 years. It would take 12 years. But then I realized the mortgage rate they have in there is higher than the actual rate we have by about 1.5%. So think about this, about 1.5%. When I put in our actual mortgage rate, lowering what they had in there initially by 1.5%, buying became better after just 7 years, from 12 to 7, because of 1.5% on the mortgage. That's one of the 4 general rules I mentioned. The mortgage interest rate absolutely matters. So in any event, that is a tool that I think you'll find useful. I'll leave links to it in the show notes. And as always, if you have any questions at all, shoot me an email at dr@DoughRoller.net. And but that brings the show to a close. Let's hit the music. There it is. Hope you enjoyed the podcast. And as I said, shoot me an email at dr@DoughRoller.net if you have any questions. Remember to sign up for the newsletter, particularly if you're interested in one or both of those webinars. You can do that at DoughRoller.net/newsletter. Very easy to do. Just take you about 22 seconds. And lastly, if you haven't yet actually subscribed to this podcast, you can do that on iTunes. Just go to DoughRoller.net/iTunes. That will redirect you to the iTunes page where this podcast resides. And if you like the podcast, or for that matter, I guess if you don't, leave me an iTunes review, an honest review and a rating. I'd really appreciate it. It's one of the ways I try to make this podcast as useful and helpful to you as I possibly can. All right, until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.